What if deconstruction is one of the best things that's happening to the church? You see, in church culture today, deconstruction gets a really bad rap. But what if it's not as bad as it seems? What if the people who are deconstructing aren't doing so because they want to sin more or because they want to run away from faith? But what if instead deconstructors are leaving the church because they were searching for Jesus and couldn't find him inside the walls of the institution? What if the reason why people are leaving the church is because their search for Jesus took them away from the institution? And maybe the biggest question of all, what if deconstruction is actually a prophetic voice for the church and its future? We answer all those questions and more on today's episode of the Church Disrupted podcast as we interview Scott McKnight, one of the co-authors of the new book, Invisible Jesus. And this is one episode that you are not going to want to miss. So buckle up and get ready for an incredible conversation on today's episode of the Church Disrupted podcast. All right, guys, welcome back to the Church Disrupted podcast with your host, Jeff Cochran. And today I have got a return guest. Scott McKnight is with us again. And today we are going to be talking about his brand new book, Invisible Jesus, that he co-wrote with Tommy Preston Phillips. We're going to be hearing from him a little later for the podcast as well. And if you haven't listened to our first episode with Scott, I highly recommend that you go ahead, you check that out. It was a fantastic episode. But Scott, you've been a New Testament professor for decades. You've written over 90 books, which I still can't fathom how someone could write 90 books, and every one I read of yours is gold. So you've been doing this for a long time. You've been around the church for a long time, and you deeply love Jesus and his church. Yet in the book, Invisible Jesus, the tagline, the subtitle is a book about leaving the church and looking for Christ. And you and Tommy really frame deconstruction, which has become a really bad word in a lot of church circles. You guys frame deconstruction in a way that I've never seen it framed before, but a way I think it needs to be framed in a conversation that we need to have about it. So tell us kind of, how did you guys get to the point of writing this book? And how would you encourage people to look at deconstruction differently through this book?
Well, thanks, Jeff. It's good to be with you again. I had a good time last time, so let's plan on it here. Tommy wrote his master's thesis under my supervision, and he wrote it on the I am sayings of the Gospel of John. And as he's a pastor, he's a preacher, he's a talker. So as he wrote his thesis, he would bring in topics. And one of the topics he would bring in was this theme of deconstruction, which at the time I was listening to people talk about it. And at one level, I was really irritated by their lack of sophistication in their use of the word deconstruction, which in the technical term is, sort of a unraveling of truth claims, and all that remains sort of is power claims. Well, most people were not using the word that way, so I just began to pay attention. I noticed that Tommy was not using it in a strict philosophical sense, but they're using it so at any rate, Tommy writes his thesis on this with a little bit of deconstruction, and I say to him, Tommy, I think we could write a book together about this. And he said, let's do it. So when he finished his thesis, we began to work on it. It took quite a while, and we would write different chapters. Originally, they were all arranged around the I am sayings. But as time went on, we had to add this and add that, and it's now not as obvious as it was. But what we believed, and this is very interesting, we believed and experienced so many people who were deconstructing in the sense of shedding, let's say, barnacles in the Christian church of beliefs that we did not think were important, but more importantly, the deconstructors did not think was important. And so it's not like they were giving up their faith and walking away from the church. They were leaving churches that didn't have a concentration on Jesus that these people were looking for. So, in other words, Luke chapter 4's emphasis upon justice at some level, preaching the gospel to the poor, liberating people from imprisonments, uh, those kinds of themes were not present. Feeding the poor, caring about justice issues. These were some of the reasons why people were walking away from the church they were in and looking for a church that was more consistent with gospel, with Jesus. So we began to write this book, and that's where we ended up. But deconstruction for us, I think, can be defined as shedding elements that are considered important to a church that weren't important to Jesus. That's the best definition I've given yet.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And you guys talk about the deconstruction movement, in Invisible Jesus, that it's really, you believe it's prophetic, and it's a
Yeah.
prophetic word for the church. Now, is all deconstruction, going to be good? Is all deconstruction going to be prophetic? No. And you guys are clear that no deconstruction story is alike. And a lot of people who are deconstructing wouldn't say, maybe ever, or at least for a while, they wouldn't call it deconstruction. And then eventually maybe they come around and say that it is. But there's quite a few things that have kind of led us to this point. But I'm just going to read some quotes from the book and let these be some of our questions, because this is gold. And I showed you before we started, but for our listeners, I have highlights probably on every other page. I have dog ears all throughout this book. If you haven't got it yet, wherever books are sold, go get Invisible Jesus. It is going to be a blessing for you, whether you are someone who's been through church hurt, spiritual abuse, or you're a pastor who really wants to help people walk through this journey. It's going to be phenomenal. But you guys said pretty early on in the book, we believe the work of deconstruction is often born of the Spirit, a movement of God attempting to bring the church back to Jesus. It's for Christ's sake that people today are walking away from churches. And then you just talk about, the listening to people and asking, questions and hearing their stories. So thinking about that, how would you say that the deconstruction movement or that work is born of the Spirit, and how is it a movement of God that is bringing people back to the church and back to Jesus?
Yeah, good one. So the original title which is a placeholder for a publisher. They work with the titles too. Authors don't get total control of that at all. Was the prophetic voice of deconstruction, and they thought that was pretty good for a seminary lecture, but not very good for the title of a book. So that was it. Now, what we think is going on in deconstruction. Let me give an example first. Many people think what's going on in the American evangelical church is a reckoning with all these pastors who have collapsed, Southern Baptist, mega church, and the Catholic Church. There is an exposure of corruption. The emperor has no clothes sort of moment in the history of the church, in the American evangelical church. And we would say that the essays, the articles, the blogs, the newspaper pieces that exposed what was going on in these churches exercised at some level a prophetic voice. It was a voice that exposed the church to its sins, just the way Amos did or Micah did in the prophets of Israel. So we think that what these deconstructors are saying and critiquing in the church are exposures of elements in the church that are inconsistent with the vision of Jesus for the kingdom of God. People may like them, they may believe in them, they may believe that being a Republican, this is an odd day to be talking about that. It's election day. I guess I can say that. Uh, it's that some people think the Democratic Party or the Republican Party is what it means to be a Christian. And I've seen so many statements like this lately, and I think, really, this is why people are walking away from the church at times. Is that, yes, they may have a different politics, and they don't want that view, the other alternative, to be imposed on them, but especially in church. So they want to hear about Jesus. And there's a way of talking about political issues that comes from the teachings of Jesus or the prophets or Deuteronomy or the New Testament that doesn't align itself with a party. But today, people are so partisan aligned that if you say you believe in, let's say, health care for everyone, people say you're a socialist. You think, now, wait a minute. Don't you think that Jesus believed in healing everybody? So we got to participate in this sort of. Others see hypocrisy in the church, sexual identity issues, issues about wages for the average person, housing. I saw an interview today of a man who said, we just can't afford, we have combined families because we can't afford to live in this community. Racism, ecology, these are things that people, the deconstructors, are saying, I don't want to be connected to a church that doesn't care about these topics or that is hypocritical or thinks that creation science and a earth or a universe or a world that's only 6,000 years old is what the Bible teaches. They want to shed those ideas and say, let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about the kingdom of God. Let's talk about the Sermon on the Mount. Let's talk about the I am sayings of Jesus. Let's talk about the mission of the church rather than some political idea or some conspiracy theory about Harry Potter. I heard these and I couldn't believe it. I don't read Harry Potter, but I think, no, come on. I remember when this was going on with Chronicles of Narnia. No kidding. They thought this, and Lord of the Rings. I'm thinking, have you read these books? These are basic stories of human history, of good and evil and victory and doing the right thing.
And all those things together have really eroded trust from a lot of Christians with the institution of the church. I think you guys,
Yeah, yeah,
y'all cited a bunch of different studies, but it was, I think you said today approximately 1 in 3 Americans trust a clergy person, and a little less than that, about 31% trust the institution. Um, what would the church as the institution in America need to do? What would pastors need to do to rebuild the trust that has been lost in the last decade or so with people? Because that lost trust is leading to a lot of people walking away from the church who, like you said, they're not walking away from Jesus. They're looking for Jesus. They're looking for the Jesus who described himself in the I am statements. So what could the institutional church and what could church leaders do to begin to build back that trust that's been lost?
yeah. Um, I think that there is one primary issue and there's a few secondary issues, and I think they're all important. The primary issue is that people want to be able to come to church and encounter God in the face of Jesus Christ. They want to be connected to a church that will, let's say, lead them to experiencing and knowing God in the face of Jesus Christ. You can go to church and hear about the Bible, but hearing about the Bible is not the same thing as meeting God in the face of Jesus Christ. So the second thing I would say, the secondary, so that's the primary idea, is they're leaving the church in a sense, and they're searching for Christ, and they want to be connected to a community where they're going to encounter Jesus. Now the secondary level is, let's say, character. What is the character of a church? Nobody who encountered Mr. Rogers thought he was a fool, or thought he was a hypocrite, or thought he was a jerk. They all said, no, that's a good man. That's a Tov man. All right. That's what people want from their local church. They don't want all the jazz and all they like the music. They like the worship. They like the preaching. They like the things, the services it provides. But they want to encounter goodness in a church. They want everything in the church to be geared around what Jesus was trying to create with the kingdom coalition that he formed. And I think that's what we can do. We can refocus the energies of the church so that when people come to our church and meet us, they're going to encounter Jesus. All right. That doesn't mean that it's going to be all sweetness and sugary and syrupy. There are times when Jesus had to utter some strong words about things that were wrong. And it's okay, unless that's a rant every week. If it's a rant every week, people are going to find somebody who looks a little bit more like Mr. Rogers. So I would say that the number one thing is to concentrate our energies so that when people come to our church, we're going to make sure, I'm thinking of Sunday morning or any gathering of the church, that we're going to make sure people see the face of God, see the face of Jesus as the face of God. And then we are going to do our best to imitate the character of Jesus in how we live, how we run what we do, uh, how people encounter us, that even in disagreements, we can, we may have to utter some stronger words, but some more direct words, but that we're not being mean spirited about it all. So that would be my answer. I think that's what the
Yeah.
deconstructors, that's what, you know, one of the studies that we had access to that's not public is that 86% of those who use the word deconstruction for themselves have remained in the church.
Wow.
86%. Now that is contrary to the way so many people are talking about deconstruction. We think that most people talking about deconstruction are talking about the 14% and making it the 100%. They think it's the 98, you know. And you know, I've had pastors say to me, I haven't met one deconstructor who wasn't trying to live in sin. Anecdotes is not evidence and it's not statistics. Yes, I've met some people the same way, but this study confirmed what Tommy had experienced in his ministry and what I experienced with so many seminary students who said to me, I meet pastors who say, I'm in a process of deconstruction. And they don't mean I'm going to leave the church. Now, some of them do, okay? What they mean is I'm trying to get rid of the nonsense that occurs in our church. And I want to get to the basics so that people can come to church looking for Jesus and they're going to see him and they're going to find him.
Yeah, no, I resonate with that strongly. As a person who is, I was a local church pastor. That was my job. That was my career for 17 years. Um, in some ways, I still think of myself as a pastor as far as operating in that gift and shepherding people around me that God gives me, but that is not my role. It's not my office anymore. Um, but I believe in Jesus and in the church as much as I ever have. My family and I are very involved in the church and the kingdom, yet I would call myself a deconstructor at this point. It took a
Hmm.
long time to warm up to that word, but there's a lot of Jenga blocks in that Jenga tower that were in there because people had told me they needed to be there. Seminary professors told me they needed to be there. And as I look at church history and as I look at scripture with open eyes, I say, I think we added those at some point along the way, and maybe they were good, but now they're causing some problems. So let me ask you this, Scott. Um, One of the things you talked about was you guys actually mentioned a view of deconstruction that a lot of church people have, and I don't want to say just church leaders, but a lot of Christians who haven't experienced this have, and it's an idea that was probably described best by Matt Chandler in a sermon, and you guys
Yeah.
actually talk about that, where he said, it's almost sexy and trendy to deconstruct. And that idea that you've mentioned already, that there are people who think that the people who deconstruct are just doing that because they want to live in sin or they don't like something the Bible teaches and they're running away from it. Yet that's most often not the case with people who are deconstructing. So, and you guys say in this book, we're not talking about trendy deconstruction because that's not the majority of deconstruction. So, what does it look like when you look at deconstruction a little more deeply? with a little more nuance for the majority of people who are deconstructing, where it's anything but sexy. It's actually very, very painful.
Yeah, that's right. And we were, I heard that statement right away from Matt Chandler, because at the time we were writing this book. Tommy and I were talking about it. I don't know what phase we were in at it, but when Matt Chandler said deconstruction is sexy, but then he took it back, and so we recorded that he took it back. But what we would say is what he said fit what a lot of people want to hear about deconstructors, is that it's just sexy, it's just a trend. Well, in fact, it's not. It's not a trend. It has always been. In fact, I would say to Matt Chandler, in fact, deconstruction is the heart of the Reformation, in that the church is semper reformanda, is the expression used in Latin, is always reforming. When you're reforming the church all the time, you're always deconstructing. So let's knock off the pretentious idea that that this is just a sexy idea that people are joining a trend. What we've experienced with people is that the fundamental reality of a deconstructor is all of a sudden a social identity crisis in which they say, I don't know if I fit in this family anymore. It's an existential crisis that is painful, and it leads to a fracturing of relationships. All of a sudden, they realize, I can't agree with this pastor anymore. I can't agree with my youth pastor. I can't agree with these three people who formerly were important and formative in my life. And what are they going to think of me? And what is going to happen to my life if I walk away from this group? Where will I go? Finding a church is not like just, oh, we'll go to the next church down the street and we'll just listen to the sermons and go home. For most people, they want the church to be some kind of fellowship and some kind of family that at least transcends some friendships. So there's a fundamental realization that they don't fit, and we say that people go through phases, and this was something I wrote up about. Is that they are in it? Let's say they're in a position of security in a church. Everything's good, peaceful. It looks good, and then all of a sudden they begin to see some things that really unnerve them. They go through a phase of what we called liminality, and that is they're they're shedding some beliefs, and they realize that this community they're in, the group that they're in, the place they work, um, would reject them if they knew what they were thinking. So they're in a phase that's liminal. They don't know if they believe those things or not. They don't know if they belong or not. And then they go through a phase that we call elimination. And elimination is actually to shed some of these ideas that this group of people they're involved. It could be, an educational institution where you work. It could be a workplace. It could be a church. It could be just a parachurch organization. All of a sudden you're starting to say, I don't believe these things. I'm not sure that this is the way to conduct missions, and I'm working for a missionary organization right now. And that is really painful. All of a sudden they're saying, my family's not going to have an income, and I don't know if I can find a job that's going to fit with my giftedness. And I'm a white guy, and it is not the best of time to be looking for a new job in an educational institution. And then finally, there is this liminal phase that leads to elimination, leads eventually, we believe, for most people, to a phase of liberation, where all of a sudden they're very comfortable with what they believe, and they don't care about the implications and the consequences that it'll have for their life. But this is not something that happens most of the time in 1 year. Now, I have a friend who is really into Christian nationalism in the sense of studying it. And he says it takes like 5 years to radicalize an American to become, let's say, a right-wing fascist Christian nationalist. Okay, people that it happens quickly for happen in a year. I would say my experience is people who are in a phase of deconstruction are in that phase for a minimum of a year, but most of the time it begins very slowly, and they can barely even come to terms with what's going on inside them at the existential level. And then they begin to turn it into statements. They go, I'm not sure I agree with this. And then they have the courage to say something to someone who's safe. And then they have the courage to say something to more people. And then all of a sudden they realize it wasn't safe and they're in trouble. And it can take years for someone to come out of a phase of deconstruction to where they finally feel liberated from those elements that what you call, they've tossed away all those Jenga blocks. By the way, I like that image. My wife and I play Jenga blocks with our grandkids, and
Yeah.
it is an interesting thing. Is that all of a sudden you say, these are some precarious pieces that I can remove, and it's still going to be a stable structure. But the people around me think I've given up everything that's important, and I know they're wrong, but I can't convince them. So I'm going to lose friendships. I'm going to lose fellowship. It's going to be a tough one.
Hey Disruptors, I want to tell you about my friend Dustin Stepp and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association and how they can help you heal from religious trauma, spiritual abuse, or just become the best version of you. East Tennessee Mentorship Association is a veteran-owned mental health support and personal development organization that acknowledges the importance of your deeply held beliefs as a factor in their overall well-being. Through one-on-one mentorship sessions, culturally neutral small groups, workshops, outdoor activities, and more, they can contribute to your journey, offering battle-tested perspectives to help you move past your obstacles and toward your potential. If you want to change your life and you're ready to do your part of the work in a supportive environment, then call East Tennessee Mentorship Association today at 865-282-4403. That's 865-282-4403. Go ahead, give them a call, and tell them Church Disrupted sent you for a special rate. I'm telling you now, you won't regret it. And thank you to East Tennessee Mentorship Association for your support of the Church Disrupted podcast. And we do at the Spiritual Abuse Institute, we've started what we call table groups, where we're taking people who have been through spiritual abuse or deep church hurt who are looking for healing, and we walk through, meeting monthly, a year-long curriculum to help walk them through the process of really stabilizing and healing. We're not walking them through really all the phases, but we want them to get to a point to where they feel like they are safe again, right? Because it's so scary at the beginning. And we use that illustration with them that deconstruction feels scary if you think someone's knocking over my tower of Jenga blocks and it's I can never put it back together. But the truth is the tower's already fallen by the time people come to us for the most part. And now we're giving them a safe space to pick up each block and just look at it and say, hey, does this belong here? Maybe I'll discard that one, right? At the beginning of deconstruction, though, when you talk about those phases, I think about liminality. In the beginning, it almost seems like more often than not, I see people who know more of what they don't believe than what they do. So taking out those individual pieces and saying, do I believe this? Do I not? We almost have to go through that foggy stage before we can begin putting back together a really solid foundation of, I comfortably believe this, which I think leads more to that liberation of, even if other people disagree, I've done the work. I feel very comfortable about what I do believe. And I don't know if you would agree with this or not, Scott. I think you would, but I tend to see most of the people that I do work with who have deconstructed have a stronger faith at the other end of it than they did before. They're not running away from faith. They have a much stronger faith because they did put in the work. What do you think?
Well, both Tommy and I tell our stories of deconstruction, and I went through exactly what you said. I remember when I was in seminary, And I told a friend said to me, Scott, I know what you don't believe. What do you believe? And I remember thinking, I really do know what I don't believe, and I'm constructing what I do believe. And I was going through that phase. Um, and I believe you're right, is that most people who come out the other end, who follow the process through, some of them just walk away, but who follow the process through, come out with a stronger, more self identified faith that is connected to Jesus, to the vision of Jesus, to the Bible, than their faith previously was connected to. So they've been healed, they've grown, and they've stabilized in their faith. So yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it.
Well, and I want to read this just because, again, if you're not sure, if you haven't gotten this book yet, I'm going to read this, and this is going to resonate so deeply with some of you. This one paragraph, I believe, is going to make you want to go pick up this book. And guys, we don't just recommend books because we interview people. If I recommend a book, it's because it's one that I believe is going to help you heal deeply. And I think this book is going to help you do this. But you guys said, probably on page like 26, 27, deconstruction is costly, costing a person's status, respect in a group, community, friends, family, perhaps even a job and income. It can affect their past, present, and future. And most people who we've talked with don't consciously choose to deconstruct. Instead, they find themselves in a deconstruction tunnel because they discover their deep, unanswered questions. And they're deeper than just annoying, they're gnawing, soul quivering questions. So, just for our listeners, if you've been in that place where you've had gnawing, deep, soul quivering questions, just know that you're not alone. But also, I want to encourage you, the Jesus that I follow can handle your questions. He is a good shepherd who can handle your questions. And you guys talk about the good shepherd um, all the way through this. When you talk about the good shepherd, though, you talk about a couple of kinds of pastors that and church leaders that Jesus really kind of talked about who are leading people to deconstruction. These are thieves in the pen. These are wolves. Can you tell us um, about those two? Like starting with I think the hireling was one of them. But could you tell us about those church leaders that don't represent Jesus well as the good shepherd, but instead are causing a lot of damage?
This goes back to Ezekiel's amazing vision of corrupted shepherds, and that God wants to be the true shepherd of the people. And corruption seems to come with the game. And I just saw a story in our local in a website about a pastor that I've known that has been there's been allegations of power abuse, and they come from such a variety of angle and people that I think they're probably true. And some people do it for the money. I've been around pastors who talk about how much they make, and I'm off duty now. I think a true caring shepherd is not a workaholic so much as it's a calling and a vocation of caring for people in the setting that that person finds themselves. They're not out trying to promote themselves. Um, and others are just, stealing sheep. But there's so much corruption that goes with the turf. We've created a model, Jeff, of churches that is so far from what was going on in the first century. Okay, I get it. Galilee, house churches, first century Asia Minor, house churches, fifth century Rome, big churches. All right, there was a social dynamic that permitted churches to be legal. And so I'm not going to idealize or even lionize the first century, but there was a sense in which these people had someone who was caring for them. You know, um, I think people who attend megachurches should ask this question. When I die, is my pastor going to bury me? Is my pastor even going to attend my family when I die? Is my pastor even going to attend the funeral?
or
if you
even any
say,
pastor I know at the
huh?
church.
Do
If it's
what?
not the pastor, is it someone I know
Yeah,
or a
that's
stranger?
right. So, and I think if you can answer that with no, you need to find a different church because that's not a church. So, Tommy was really big on this "I am the shepherd, the good shepherd" passage when he wrote his thesis, and he has created a church in it's called Watermark in Tampa that is basically small groups, and the small groups care for one another. They eat with one another. They fellowship with one another. It's not all based on Tommy and his band, Tommy Priest, his Priest and Phillips band. I mean, he's very good, and I just heard him sing the other day. It was I was impressed. So it's not an attraction model where we bring in 4,000 people every Sunday. It is instead a gathering of people who have been fellowshipping with one another throughout the week. And I've found other churches that are big churches that say actually we're small groups that meet together on Sunday. Um, and if you don't want to participate in a small group, go ahead and come on Sunday, but you're not really a part of our church. And I think that the Good Shepherd theme is that we need to look for pastors who care for us, who know our names, who know our stories, who care about us, who care about our stories, our children, our histories. If they can't do that, they're not pastoring. That's all there is to it.
You said something similar in our last podcast. I remember putting up a clip and I didn't think much of it. You know, it's always the clips you don't think much of that tend to, go viral. But it was one that it caused a lot of rage with people trying to protect the institution. When you ask that question, do you know who's going to care for your family? you know, um, if they pass away. And if you don't, there's some questions you got to ask about your church. But I think part of the volatility that came from people in megachurches, especially pastors, pastors' wives, pastors' families, I think the volatility shows just how far we'll go sometimes to protect the institution instead of the people, and that gets really dangerous. So I want to do this, and Scott, I can cut this out if I need to. I got one final question that I always ask that is quick, but I wanted to ask you one more question if I could, but I
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
make sure that we have time because I
yeah.
looked
We
at
got
it. I
time.
was going to ask you about sea lining, and I didn't know if you had a few extra
Yeah,
minutes.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Always want to honor your time, and I know we're coming close, but I found the idea of sea lioning and how it's used with a lot of deconstructors fascinating. And I think just for people to hear that and hear how that works, it's a reminder that no, I'm not crazy because so many of them have experienced it, and it's very crazy making when it happens. Could you explain sea lining? And you talk about in the book Jesus was sea lioned by the Pharisees, and a lot of us get sea lioned when we start asking these deep questions about church and theology.
yeah. Well, it comes from the idea. I mean, I've been to San Francisco and Mission Bay, and if you've ever been there, uh, and you look at the wharf and you look at these little docks, whatever they're called, platforms, a sea lion will come up here, and then a sea lion will come up there, and you think, where are they? They're all over the place. And this term then has become an expression for those who are being asked questions, and deconstructors experience it this way, as Jesus did in the Gospel of John. Okay, someone says to you, "Do you believe in the Trinity?" And they go, "Well, yeah, of course I believe in the Trinity, but that's not the top thing I'm thinking about right now." "Well, do you believe in inerrancy?" And then they say, "Well, I believe this." Do you believe in the pre-rib rapture? And it's just all of a sudden you realize these people aren't asking me questions. They don't care what I say. They're trying to figure out if I fit in the group or if I'm a heretic. They're not asking me what I believe and why I believe what I believe. They're trying, in a sense, to prove me wrong or find some question that will lead me to give an answer that I trip over their sacred cows. And now I'm a dangerous person or I don't fit, and now they can fire me, and now they can get rid of me. And um, I know, I know because I've heard people who've gone through deconstruction, who've worked in churches, I know they've been treated like this more times than is right and should ever happen. And Tommy knows about this, and Tommy has himself been sea lion by church authorities. So all of a sudden you realize they're gonna batter me with a series of questions, but they really don't care what my answers are because they're just accusing me by what they're asking me. They're saying, we don't really think you fit, and we're going to find something where you don't fit. So is that a fair explanation? Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, no, and I think it's so helpful because often when we start walking through these things, many of the people I talk to that we believe that the questions are real and people are really wanting to have a discussion and a conversation as brothers and sisters. And then before you know it, you realize you've just been trapped and they were looking for one place you would stumble where you wouldn't fit the status quo, where they could label you as a heretic. And that's a pet peeve of mine anyway, Scott, that when we look at, through history, which, you as New Testament professor are going to see, heresy was essentially, issues like creedal issues. It was stuff that, the ecumenical councils that we all agree on. It was departure from those kind of things. And today we use heresy loosey goosey, that we'll call
Yeah.
someone a heretic if they believe differently about us than really any theological issue. We'll label them
You,
a heretic
you're,
and
you're
and put
totally
them over
right.
there. You know,
And furthermore, you couldn't call someone a heretic until they had been brought before a council. The questions had been asked. They understood the questions, and they responded and said, I don't affirm these certain truths. Then a person was a heretic. You can't just start accusing people of things without asking them what they believe. And then, Jeff, on this one, there's so many things that people, and this is the deconstruction issue, that people raise to the top level, that this is the most important thing. Do you believe in the pre-trib rapture? And if you don't, I don't know that you believe in Jesus. And I just saw this.
which is a fairly new theological idea throughout history.
Oh, yeah. I just saw this online by someone I know. He's an author I know, who said anybody who votes for a Democrat is demonic. And I'm sitting there thinking, you just threw under the bus virtually every European Christian. Not under the bus. You threw them into hell. You know, this is this is just no. This is just wrong. And and I want to say, stop. Don't do this sort of thing. You've lost contact with the centrality of, let's say, the Nicene Creed, Father, Son, and Spirit, not rapture questions, not political questions, not creation science questions, but the core of what we believe. And one of the things that Tommy came across, but that I came across, oh boy, 30 years ago, I guess, was centered set thinking and bounded set thinking. And he just loves that idea. And I think the deconstructing movement is healthy because it wants the centered set to be centered and the bounded issues to be at the boundaries. That is so healthy and the deconstructors, that's what they're looking for. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And you guys go deep into that in the book. So again, another reason to get this book, the difference between centered set thinking and bounded thinking. One of the things that we run into a lot, Scott, with the Spiritual Abuse Institute, which is kind of the parent nonprofit of Church Disrupted, we'll get people who are trying to sea lion us and trap us, or to see, sometimes not to trap us, they just want to see, can I be in this space and know that you all believe exactly what I believe? And the question they'll ask us is, what is your statement of faith? And
Yeah.
the answer we generally give them is, we intentionally don't have a statement of faith because our board and our podcast hosts have different theological viewpoints. But if you needed a statement of faith, we'll always point them back. Look to the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, because we all believe in those creeds. On everything else, there are differences, and we celebrate the differences and we have discussion. One of the things we've said from the beginning, we are after conversation, not consensus, because consensus doesn't help us grow, but conversation always does. So,
I
um,
don't know if I said this before, but the evangelical community has not nurtured conversation. It has nurtured charismatic didactic declarations. And that's why sea lioning is so important, because evangelicals who are starting to, they want to ask you a question. They're probably trying to figure out where you fit on the spectrum. And they're asking a question about Calvinism, and you realize they're Calvinists. They think only Calvinists are truly faithful, and they're trying to figure out if I'm in their group or not. That's not conversation. And I've often referred to a book by Cravieri called The Art of Conversation. Um, I've experienced conversation among PhD students and among professors. I experience very little conversation in the church. I experience it in my classes because it's an open environment. Um, and people are expected to be able to feel safe and express themselves and to keep it in the room. So, conversation is so important, and the deconstructors want a place where there can be conversation.
Well,
Anyway,
the conversation is so powerful, and one of the things that surprised me so much, Scott, and this probably won't surprise you, but it always surprises me is, we have guests on with very different theological backgrounds to talk about these issues of healthy and safe churches, right? And every time we have a guest on who is different than a certain subset of our followers, we have massive unfollows. And I just let people go because it's a hey, we're never going to agree on everything, but these
mm-hmm.
conversations are more important than our agreement, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So I want to ask you one final question, and then let you get out of here. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm always so grateful for your time and the gift that you give us in these conversations, Scott. But now that you've written this book, because this is a very different work than A Church Called Tove, right?
yeah, it is.
It's a very different work than the last two books, really, that you've done. Um, what would your kind of encouragement be as we land the plane for both pastors and church leaders and those who find themselves in the middle of deconstruction?
Well, we would love for people to read our book because it's, as one of our editors said, and then we put it in the book. It's the exit interview. It's the result of the exit interview that churches never give. And we want pastors to listen to this and to say, what can we do in our churches that will make our church a safe place for people to explore these questions, and that we will nurture questions and not coerce answers, and we will walk with these people through these difficult times, and we will listen in such a way that we will learn from them. Now, listening just to know what, just to get information about what's going on is snooping. It's like having moles. But listening for the sake of learning together in a mutual framework of growth into Christ likeness is really the goal of this book. And we think the churches need to become a safe place for people with questions, and a safe place, of course, for people who've been wounded by the church and abused by the church and traumatized by the church. And if it's not safe, the wounded will disappear. They'll walk away because they'll catch it right away. They'll catch the danger.
What would your encouragement be for those that find themselves in the middle of that deconstruction? They're in the middle of dealing with that wounding.
Yeah. Tommy and I have both said this so many times. You're not alone. You may feel alone, but there are a lot of people going through this process. And there have always been a lot of people going through this process. So find the voices. I point to people who will get them back to Jesus, like Tom Wright, who will write books that they read and they go, "Wow, this restores my faith in Jesus." Um, so, you know, they're not alone, and God is with them. God sees them. Jesus wants them to turn their face toward Him because His face is toward them.
That's so good. Well, one of the things I appreciate most about you guys writing this book is not even anything that you said in the book. but it's the fact that a New Testament professor who loves Jesus and loves the church and a practicing pastor who loves Jesus and loves the church are the ones who have said, hey, maybe we need to listen to the
Yeah,
prophetic voice of this movement. This
yeah.
is not people who have left the church or ran away. You guys are as invested in the church and love Jesus as much as any people that I know. So thank you for standing up and being a voice for those that feel like they don't have a voice. And last question before we go, where can people grab the book and how can they follow your work?
Well, I don't know where people buy books, but I believe in brick and mortar stores. So if you can go to a local bookstore, go ahead there. But you can always buy it online. Zondervan sells the book. Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I don't know all the places you can buy online. I I admit I buy my books from one of those names that I just mentioned, and so it's out there and it's available. Just Google and then start thinking about where you can buy the book. And uh, I'm more than willing to pay a little bit more to help a local bookstore,
Yeah.
but we don't have one here,
Mm,
and I'm in the northern suburbs. I don't know of any bookstore really.
yeah. That's tough. They've almost disappeared. I appreciate that as a small business owner of
Yeah.
supporting local where you can. And how can they follow you? Because you're writing all the time. How can they follow your work you're writing and find out about new books before they come out?
Yeah, I have a Substack, Scott McKnight Substack. That's a newsletter, and I'm on Twitter or X. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, and I'm on Threads. My publisher wants me on those things because I don't know. I don't know much about them, but I do them.
Yeah, well, you're a little bit of everywhere, and I appreciate your work. Well,
Thank you.
again, Scott, thank you so much. Thank you to every listener for listening today. I hope this has blessed you as much as it's blessed me. We're gonna have Tommy Priest and Phillips on soon to talk about the book as well. But if you haven't yet, go pick up your copy of Invisible Jesus. If you want to get the audiobook, it's well done as well. I love this book so much. I listened to it the first time and then read through it all over again. So it's a phenomenal read. Grab that if you haven't yet. Scott, we're so grateful for you. And for our listeners, until the next time, grace and peace. We'll see you on the next episode of the Church Disrupted podcast.